Good evening. It's 10:38 p.m. on June 14th, 2021. I have changed my mind. I'm going to present something, or at least a synopsis of something. I said earlier I was not going to. Why? Because the material conditions have revealed at this time frame a point at which I think it's important to do this. I had said that last week on June 11th of 2021, I had reviewed a opinion of a former Attorney General, Texas, John Cornyn. In the course of evaluating it, I understood that there were potential conflicts, and I postponed my evaluation until after 7:30 p.m. Why? Because the late window and the late transaction processing period for the Federal Reserve closes at 6:30 on the East Coast. So I wanted to assure that what would have been recorded as business for the day had been completed. The reason that this was necessary is because before 5 p.m. here in Dallas, Texas, which would have been the time frame during which I would have read it and potentially remarked on it, I had already finished reading a opinion from former Attorney General Greg Abbott. And in that opinion, it referenced other opinions from John Cornyn that were not this one. Three, specifically. Each of them had their own individual document number. These correlations are what I understand to be a form of operationalization. See, insofar as I already know that the entire catalog of Greg Abbott's opinions were made available for collateral in connection with an international trip he took abroad as governor, I understand what the potential implications of that kind of correlation are. And it was prudent to do it after the close of business for that day specifically, but to still do it after the close of business that day. My understanding is that so doing would have allowed for a kind of security without allowing for it to potentially be disabused. See, the awareness, the circumstances at the time let me know it needed to be done that day, but it was not supposed to clear as a transaction with the other one, right? You don't usually transport the firearm and the bullets together. However, after I made that voice recording, somebody stole it. And because I understand, because they stole it, and they gave it to somebody else, that's how I understand it now, that element of the security was not available. It would be the equivalent of taking somebody's firearm and getting the bullets from somewhere else. And that's what happened this past weekend. I had said earlier I was not going to repeat it. As a matter of fact, I've been transcribing these things after I do voice recordings. And I intentionally did not retranscribe this. I have written notes that were connected to what I said verbally. I said I wasn't going to do that because I wasn't going to give into a form of extortion. And the crimes had already been committed. The paper is confirmation. I made the decision to postpone it by 4:48 p.m. Central Standard Time, which I understood was plenty of time to have responded before 5 o'clock, but I waited until 7:38 p.m. The opinion is JC-0004, JC-0004, Permanent School Fund Investment in Mortgage-Backed Securities at below market interest rate, incompatible with County Commissioner Trustees' duties. It just so happened that this past weekend, on December 12th, would have been one day after 6 months following December 11th. December 11th of 2020, there were issues of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of pass-through certificates for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The 6-month anniversary would have been June 11th, 2021. Hence the caution. It was because of this that I was very concerned and yet very alert when I found this, specifically addressing the relationship between the permanent school fund and mortgage backed securities. Among the things it discusses is a very important process that Cornyn did and undertook. That was so far first time I've seen this, which is he establishes the author of the request, who is a member of the Texas State Senate, as a subordinate, i.e., the reference she makes is subordinate to the authority he cites. There was a request for consideration under the Public Funds Investment Act, but he said that instead he was going to evaluate it under Article 7, Section 6 of the Texas Constitution. The invocation of the Constitution specifically by article and section, I understand, implies a reference to the original Bill of Rights that discusses how no other law in Texas is allowed to be illegal or in violation of the Bill of Rights. It is an attempt to say this is the ultimate authority, and what you're requesting is consideration under some form of subordinate process. In that consideration, he makes a very specific determination. I started my comment by citing the 3 footnotes that he had in the opinion. One was on one page, the other 2 were on the last page. That process, and just the footnotes alone, had a concurrent discursive method to what was presented in the formal text of the opinion. I believe it could be understood to be a form of ultimatum. One of the manners of which this is to be considered has to do with his distinction in terms of the role of the commissioner's court as the trustees and the specific references to pass-throughs. The understanding that the mortgage holder engages some form of agent that is paid a fee to facilitate a pass-through to the security holder, and that by virtue of being trustees, the county commissioners specifically are not the holders of these specific securities. As a result, the interest is in assuring that the holders of the securities get the highest rate of interest possible, and hence the below market rate consideration of the specific mortgage-backed securities reference, which were intended for low-income families, would not be within the realm of appropriate consideration of the express intent in issuing securities in consideration of the pass-through status. My concern, as I expressed it in my response, was twofold. First of all, participants in the permanent school fund, the people who benefit from the permanent school fund primarily are whom? Texas has a very significant history of contestation regarding application, or as some would say, gross misapplication of the permanent school fund. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the Republic of Texas. Disabusing the school fund for anything from railroad bonds to speculation on election processes is part of the history of Texas and part of the very significant debate, especially in the early days of Texas, and especially in consideration of the Texas annexation and what happened when Texas engaged in deals related to bonds issued by the state of Texas that were allowed to be held by the federal treasury, during which time the federal treasury altered the terms of the bonds. This is part of the context in which I understand it's appropriate to consider what it means to identify in whose interest do you understand the permanent school fund functions. Now, if you understand that the school fund functions in the interest of students that are going to public schools or are going to schools that are availed of at least the alleged benefits of having a permanent school fund, then you understand some of those students come from families that are low income. And so the consideration of a family that's low income having access to the benefits of securities associated with providing them with their own mortgages is, I believe, a priority over and above the increased rate of fee that somebody assisting a pass-through in consideration of a higher interest-bearing security instrument is going to obtain, even if they personally have children that are students in the schools. There's a material difference and a constitutionally material difference in understanding the permanent school fund from that perspective. Not only that, allowing for security instruments that operate in accordance with a higher level of interest due to the nature of the consideration of the original security arrangement also says something about risk. And it also says something about what happens if that risk is triggered in connection with a default. For that reason, as I said in my response, I do not agree with the approach that was taken by former Attorney General John Cornyn on this specific topic. Now, I recorded this as a sound recording. I later tried to transcribe it, but as I said, it had been deleted. Somebody else took that specific opinion. I finished my review and commentary by 8:07 p.m. Central Standard Time on June 11, 2021. It's exactly 10:50 p.m. on June 14, 2021.